Buenas tardes. Perdóneme, pero con permiso hablaré en inglés. I thank you for that kind introduction. I've been asked to talk with you today about a number of things about biotechnology, about the contributions that is made that we encounter in our daily lives, about some of the challenges that we face, how we got where we are today, what the future holds, and how we can meet some of those challenges of the future. That's an awful lot to cover, and so please bear with me as we transition from one topic to the next, but hopefully we'll bring it all together in the end. But before I talk about some of these issues, some of these complicated and fascinating issues, I thought I should give you a little bit of background that wasn't included in that generous introduction, to tell you a little bit more about where I'm coming from, how I got interested in these issues, why I care about them, to give you a sense of my point of view on some of these topics. These two pictures, the one on your left shows me doing what I enjoy most in all the world. This is my family, my wife, and my son and my daughter. Last summer, we hiked the subway in Zion National Park. How many of you have been to Zion? Excellent. Well, the subway is the second best known hike in the park after the Zion Narrows, which we did 3 years ago. It's much more technical, much more difficult, much more challenging, and it is spectacularly beautiful. I am a passionate environmentalist. I love the wilderness, I love nature, and I take my family out in it as much as possible. Part and parcel of that same interest in the world we live in, I'm also an amateur beekeeper. The way some people have cellars full of exotic wines, I have a honey cellar. I have a collection of honey varieties from around the world that I picked up in my travels, and they vary almost as much, if not more, than wine does. It's a fascinating way to become acquainted with the biology in the places that I visit and how it compares to what we find elsewhere in the world. Because of my interest in these subjects, many years ago, out of concern to make sure that my children and their children have plenty of opportunities to enjoy the things that I value, I asked myself, what can I do to help leave the world a better place than I found it, which wasn't a very bad place. As the Native American chief Seneca put it, we should make our decisions about important things in life based on the impact that they will have to the 7th generation of your descendants. And looking at the world in this way, it became very clear that the single human activity that has the largest impact on the environment, far more than any other thing that humans do, is agriculture. So if we want to leave a green and sustainable world with lots of room for wilderness and biodiversity, we need to find a way, facing the challenge of feeding 9 billion people that we expect to see on the planet in the next 30 years or so, we need to find a way to grow more on existing land with fewer inputs and less environmental impact. That argues for finding ways to improve our agriculture, which today is already vastly more productive than anything we've ever seen in the past. So that's how I got involved in the study of agriculture, and in particular in the study of agricultural biotechnology. I started out as a skeptic. I'm still a skeptic, but 35 years ago, I was concerned about biotechnology and the potential negative consequences on biodiversity. So I started to look at these topics and pay attention to them. And so some of those attitudes and points of views we'll see reflected in the rest of my talk today. One of the founding documents of the modern American environmental movement is Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And in that book, she spends the first 16 chapters documenting what she saw as the negative contributions of an excessive reliance on inputs to agriculture from synthetic chemistry. But she doesn't just build an indictment about practices that she thought were ill-advised and unsustainable. In the final chapter, chapter 17, she talks, particularly in paragraph 3, about what her vision of a greener, more sustainable future would be. And as you can see in this quote, what she talks about is harnessing our increasing understanding of biological principles and the relationships between organisms in order to bend that improved understanding to put it to work in the ways that we produce food, feed, and fiber on our agricultural lands. What she's describing in this last chapter, her vision for the future, is in fact what the companies that produce seeds with value added through biotechnology are pursuing. I would submit to you that the member companies of Acabe are among Rachel Carson's proudest intellectual descendants, those who are doing the very most to bring her vision of a greener future to life. One of the main topics of the conversation that I'd like to have with you today has to do with GMOs, genetically modified organisms. What is a GMO? This is a term that's very commonly used in the conversations on modern agriculture, and the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization and World Health Organization came together to define the term as an organism that is produced through the operation of genetic mechanisms that you don't find happening in nature. Now, I was in the room when this definition emerged, and I was the one saying, stop, wait a minute. But I was one scientist among 140 lawyers and diplomats. So I apologize for my incomplete success, but this definition, which is widely used throughout discourse today, which is the basis for many laws around the world for dealing with risk assessment and management for crops and foods produced through biotechnology, this term defines something that does not exist. Every so-called GMO that exists in this world that was produced by genetic engineers in a lab was derived by people working with enzymes that we discovered in nature, using those enzymes to do the things that they do in nature in the ways we find them happening in nature. So everything that is called a genetically modified organism based on the assumption that it's something that doesn't happen in nature is misunderstood and wrongly described. Every living thing that exists is a genetically modified organism. So keep in the back of your minds as we go through the rest of the conversation today the fact that the entire conversation is based on a profound, factually incorrect misunderstanding of the fundamentals of biology. If you keep that in mind, some of the incongruencies that we encounter in these conversations will become more easy to understand. Another explanation of this principle shows the ancestors of the animals and plants that we use commonly in agriculture around the world today. The so-called non-genetically modified ancestors are dramatically different in most cases than what we recognize today and most often consider as natural. How many of you have dogs at home? Okay, you are hosts to genetically modified wolves. And if you want to talk about things to be concerned about, well, most of us don't have much reason to be worried about the dogs that we have in our houses. The wolves are an entirely different matter. So again, the notion that natural is good and genetically modified is bad and more dangerous is a presupposition that does not withstand contact with the facts. One of my favorite examples is corn. You see on the left here an example of corn as it existed some 10,000 years ago. What we think of as corn today the so-called natural varieties that produce what you see on the right with the large ear with many kernels, that is the fruit of about 4 millennia of selective breeding by our foremothers in Central America, who turned what you see on the left into something like what you see on the right. And not only that, but the natural processes of evolution and gene flow that took place in the evolution of the crop, the teosinte on the left, resulted in a species within which fully 50% of the DNA in teosinte is DNA that originally came from plant viruses that infected teosinte's ancestor. So the idea that genes belong in one organism and shouldn't move and don't move in nature, these ideas are contradicted at every turn by what we actually find in nature. I don't know how many of you have seen on foods that you buy in the grocery store the little monarch butterfly symbol with the non-GMO label. Some of you have seen this. This is a marketing gimmick that emerged to provide people who claim to want to be able to choose to avoid genetically modified foods the opportunity to do so. The irony here is that the monarch butterfly they use as their logo itself is a natural genetically modified organism which contains genes that have been inserted by a baculovirus which infects the monarch butterfly in the past. We encounter products of genetic engineering of recombinant DNA techniques in our daily lives at every turn, both in the agricultural and the biomedical arena. One of the very first products that ever got put on the market was human insulin that was cultivated in bacteria grown in large-scale fermentation tanks. The insulin thus produced, which is the global standard today for treatment of diabetics and abnormal glucose metabolism, this insulin is vastly superior and far safer and more effective for humans to use than what we used before this technology allowed us to develop this product. In my living memory, in the 1960s, the standard treatment for diabetes involved insulin extracted from the pancreas of swine or from cattle. This produced a product that was nowhere near as effective as the insulin we have today, thanks to biotechnology, and had associated a variety of risks and potential hazards that we have completely eliminated. Another topic that I'm personally very invested in, one of the arguments you will hear about those who are opposed to so-called GM foods is the claim that they increase potential allergy risks for people in foods. This is particularly important to me because my son, whom I showed you in the first picture, my son has a potentially life-threatening allergy to peanuts. So every morning I see him go out the door to school, and I know that there's a possibility, greater than zero, that he might not come home as a consequence of something as simple as a schoolmate, a classmate sharing a cookie. That could kill him. But unlike conventional foods, foods derived from crops improved through biotechnology are the only foods that are screened in advance to make sure they do not present new allergy risks. So in this case, as in almost every other, when the opponents of GMOs argue that this or that risk is something we need to be concerned about, the truth is in fact the exact opposite. Not only are biotech foods the only foods you can be confident will not present a new risk of food allergies, biotechnology is being applied in the medical arena in a variety of ways so as to make it possible to preemptively treat people with peanut allergies so they do not react when they're accidentally exposed to peanuts. And furthermore, plant breeders using biotechnology are today working to delete from peanuts the genes that encode for the proteins that cause the allergic response, thereby making a type of peanut that my son could safely eat without fear for his health. They're also doing this with other major known food allergens like soy and dairy and so forth. Once again, biotechnology is not only not the source of problems as opponents allege, but they actually are the only realistic sources of solutions to those kinds of problems. Biotechnology in Hawaii, I did my graduate work in Hawaii. I spent a lot of time working on the Big Island. The Big Island is where most of the commercial papaya is produced in the islands of Hawaii. Most of that is grown by small farmers of Puerto Rican or Portuguese descent. And the papaya in Hawaii was plagued with a virus, papaya ring spot virus, that was introduced from Southeast Asia, and it destroyed the papaya crop in Hawaii. Researchers from Cornell University and the University of Hawaii came together, figured out a way to apply our understanding of plant biology based on discoveries made down the hall from the lab I worked in my postdoc in St. Louis at Washington University. And they developed a genetically engineered papaya variety that resists this papaya ring spot virus. In so doing, these researchers not only rescued the papaya industry in Hawaii, but they made it possible for the first time to grow organic papaya in Hawaii, because the protection, what they call the protective halo created by these biotech papayas that resist the virus, suppressed the population of these pathogenic viruses in Hawaii to such low levels that it's now possible to grow susceptible papaya in a way that organic growers do and still be able to enjoy a harvest thanks to the disease suppression due to the biotechnology enhanced papaya. A friend of mine in Thailand developed a similar virus-resistant papaya, and he was aiming to introduce that into commerce in Thailand almost 20 years ago. Greenpeace staged a protest, and they dumped on the front door of the Ministry of Health in Thailand a huge truckload full of biotech papaya as a protest. Thai farmers and citizens are not stupid. They saw this happening. A lot of people grabbed these papayas, took them home, extracted the seeds, and now those biotech papayas, they are still not legally approved to be grown anywhere in Southeast Asia, but they are in fact grown widely throughout Southeast Asia, including in China. So even where governments fail to allow farmers access to this technology, if the farmers can get access to the technology, they will use it. There are multiple examples of this. I can give a separate talk just on that topic. This is a slide put together by a friend of mine who grows GM sugar beets in Idaho. And what this shows is the techniques that he has to use to control weeds in conventional sugar beet populations on the left side of his truck, and the technology he needs to use to control weeds in biotech improved sugar beets on the right side of his truck. So you will sometimes hear opponents of agricultural biotechnology argue that it increases the use of synthetic chemistry, and biotech agriculture relies more heavily on chemical inputs than do conventional or organic agriculture. This claim is false. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Bangladesh, the brinjal is what they call eggplant. Brinjal is important to the culture of the people who live in Bangladesh, the food culture. It is as important to them as plantains and bananas are here in Puerto Rico or throughout Central America. There are over 200 different varieties of brinjal. They are plagued by some lepidoptera, some caterpillar pests of moths or butterflies, and they've been very difficult to control. Historically, in the past 10, 15 years, the methods for controlling this insect pest to produce a harvest of brinjal has involved spraying every other day, every day, with chemical pesticides to kill and control these caterpillar pests. That's a substantial burden. to substantial exposure of these pesticides to farmers. With biotech improved varieties, we've eliminated the need to spray for those insect pests and using a gene that encodes for a protein that is commonly used as a pesticide by organic growers, the Bt protein. Farmers in India growing cotton have adopted the planting of biotech improved cotton with the same pest resistance technique that the brinjal carries. And again, they have dramatically decreased their reliance on chemical pesticide sprays and increased their incomes significantly. This graph is from the Economic Research Service, and it shows the trend over time of the use of pesticides in U.S. corn and cotton fields, dramatic declines thanks to the value added through biotech introduced insect resistance traits. This slide shows an ear of corn. Again, corn is a great example. This shows damage resulting from the Asian corn borer on some corn in the Philippines. This is corn grown by Edwin Paraluman in the southern island of Mindanao. You know, which ear of corn would you like to eat? This shows farmers in South Africa growing, again, biotech insect-resistant corn. You can see the dramatic increases in yield of the GM variety versus the non-biotech variety. Again, the decline in pesticide use in corn production based on USDA's Economic Research Service data falls in reverse proportion to the adoption rate of biotech improved insect resistant varieties. This shows the results of a field trial in Honduras, and it shows not only the damage caused by the caterpillar insect pest on the non-biotech corn variety, but you can see here is something that's even more significant. The insect damaged corn is infested with a mold. This is significant because that mold produces a toxic chemical residue which is among the most effective carcinogenic compounds that we know about. These mycotoxins, or fungal toxins produced by these infections, are known to cause higher levels of neural tube defects in brain development, in fetuses in utero. They are known to cause dramatic increases in the frequency of cancer of the mouth and the throat, the upper alimentary tract, in people who eat lots of corn and depend upon it. And so biotech improved insect-resistant corn varieties virtually eliminate, they cut by a factor of at least 100 the residual impact of these mycotoxins in corn harvests. And so as a consequence, in those populations that rely heavily on corn for a major dietary staple for their calorie intake, you see the frequency of some of these types of cancers declining again in inverse proportion to the adoption of biotech improved corn varieties. The fact that 300,000 American corn growers have made biotech improved cotton varieties the new standard of quality against which corn harvests in the United States are measured is an indicator of the value that farmers find in this technology. A global summary of the experience that farmers around the world have had growing crops improved through biotechnology is captured in this slide. What it shows is that 18 million farmers in 28 countries around the world are growing biotech crops today. Over the past 20 years, the amount of land area devoted to biotech crops has increased by a factor of 100. Bear in mind that farmers are inherently very conservative. They are very conservative in their approach to risk because if they miscalculate, they're out of business. And the fact that you've seen this technology adopted by farmers wherever they've had access to it as rapidly as they have is really quite dramatic. We've seen this produce dramatic increases of up to 22%, I think it says, in yields, with increases in profitability, upwards of 60%, a decrease in the use of chemical pesticides for insect control by 37%, and we've saved substantial amounts of land that can play host to biodiversity and remain in a wild form rather than needing to be converted to agriculture to produce equivalent harvests. The economic impacts are significant. $17.7 billion in value added is the contribution thanks to biotech improved seeds in 2014 alone. Cumulative total of $150.3 billion. The surplus production in soybeans is, I can't read it backwards, 158 million tons, and in maize and corn, 322. With a decrease in pesticide use of 503 million kilograms, almost 1 billion pounds of pesticides that were not sprayed on crops thanks to biotech improvements. The overall environmental impact of the agriculture that uses biotechnology has been decreased by about 18%. With benefits like this, it's easy to see why farmers have adopted these crops at such dramatic rates. This shows the U.S. farmers' uptake of soybeans, cotton, and corn, and how quickly over a period of less than 2 decades they reach saturation. The same pattern is reflected on the global level. As I said, 28 countries with 18 million farmers, and it's important to remember that 17 million of those farmers are farmers in the developing world. In small countries in the developing world primarily. And 4 years ago, for the first time, as you can see in the red line, the amount of acreage devoted to biotech crops grown in developing countries exceeded that grown in industrial nations. And that reflects, again, another one of the unique benefits of biotech improved crops is that the value is delivered in a way that is scale neutral. Unlike some of the advances of the Green Revolution, you don't have to buy a large combine or harvesters to enjoy the benefits biotech delivers to crops. All you have to do is take the seed and plant it, and that works just as well if you're planting it in your backyard or planting it on 100,000 acres. This again illuminates some of the reasons that farmers adopt these crops because of higher yields, decreased pesticide costs, and so forth. These curves show the rate of herbicide use in biotech improved crops for weed control. And unlike the pesticide use curves, which show dramatic drops, these curves tend to show very little change, and even in some cases perhaps slight increases. This is the source for the claim that opponents make that biotech has led to an increase in the use of chemical supplements in farmers' fields. But that mistakes a very important fact to consider here. Yes, it is true that the use of some herbicides has increased, but those herbicides that have increased in their use have replaced other herbicides which have far higher toxic levels and secondary impacts. And so the overall environmental impact of these newer biotech-associated herbicides, like glyphosate, Roundup, has been, as we mentioned in an earlier slide, a dramatic decrease in the overall environmental impact. And again, these biotech-enhanced methods of weed control have contributed to a dramatic surge in the use of conservation tillage by farmers. So you no longer have to, because you have good chemically based weed control, you no longer have to plow. And when you avoid plowing, your soils are much more healthy. You can sequester more carbon. You spend less fuel on your tractors going through the fields. And that leads to dramatic reduction in the amount of fossil fuels used in farming and the amount of carbon dioxide emissions. So with a great story like this, with such positive impacts and results, how is it that there is still so much fear amongst the general public about GMOs, about crops improved through biotechnology. Well, here's an explanation right here. For the past 20 years, we have seen a segment of the food industry adopt a campaign of fear-based marketing whereby they misrepresent what GMOs are, what biotech crops and foods are, with the specific purpose of raising their own market share at the expense of their competition. They use these scary images of hypodermic needles stuck into corn and tomatoes and whatever you can conjure up. But in fact, the reality is that biotech crops are not made in that type of a technique. But the bottom picture, in fact, shows, as does this next slide, a method that organic growers use to control some insect pests in certain crops. I have a backyard garden. It is an organic garden. I grow it accidentally in terms of the types of principles that organic farmers use. I compost, I don't use pesticide sprays and so forth, but I've had a heck of a hard time. You'd think anybody could grow zucchini, right? Well, I've had a hard time growing zucchini because in my neighborhood there is a squash borer moth that lays its larvae in the stalks of squash and they destroy the plant. Biotech growers have the same problem, organic growers have the same problem, and so they mix up a liquid solution of the Bt protein and inject it into the stems of their squash plants, and it protects them against the corn borer. So the irony here is that the fear-mongering community from the organic industry, which uses these scary images to try to frighten people about biotech foods, are actually using images that more accurately reflect what some organic growers use. Stuart Brand has said, I dare say the environmental movement has done more damage I can't read it backwards. The summary of the statement is Stuart Brand, who's one of the founders of the modern environmental movement, has said that in the environmental movement's opposition to biotechnology and the myths associated with that, they've done more damage to the environment than has happened in any other way. Kevin Folta is a science communicator and plant breeder at University of Florida. And he says there are so many misunderstandings about biotechnology and crops improved through biotechnology. The first is the notion that there is in fact any scientific controversy on the issue of safety at all, because there isn't. I've provided here a number of references which illuminate and document the worldwide scientific consensus on the safety of so-called GMOs. This consensus on the safety of these products is in fact stronger than the consensus around climate change. And there are dramatic examples of this. There is a website called Si Quiero Transgénicos, and on that website you will find a list of 275 scientific bodies around the world that have looked at these issues associated with the safety of crops improved through biotechnology and found that they are at least as safe as, if not safer than, the alternatives. If you're really worried about food safety, it's important to remember that genetic modification is a plant breeding technique. It's a plant breeding method. It's not an ingredient. In terms of things that kill people, alcohol kills 3.3 million individuals in the US every year. Tobacco, 6 million. Obesity, as many as 3 million. The total death toll from biotech crops so far is 0. What do opponents really want? It's hard to read some of this backwards, sorry. in opposing foods derived from crops improved through biotechnology, what do opponents really want? They claim they want freedom of choice, but in fact, their actions indicate quite otherwise. Andy Kimbrell from the Center for Food Safety has been very clear. We're going to force them to label it. If we force them to label it, then we can organize boycotts. Andy is completely funded by the organic community. Ronnie Cummins from the Organic Consumers Association has said very clearly that what their objective is how quickly can they transform organic from a small niche market into the dominant force. And the first step is mandatory labels. This is a well-known and highly respected food blogger, and he talks about the perception of organic food as more nutritious, but it isn't, as safer, but it isn't. There are a whole lot of myths that have been propagated by 20 years of fear-based marketing for the organic community, and that's the reason, in fact, that we face the groundswell of opposition that we sometimes see, which is largely the product of this advertising campaign that Steve Novella described, based on misrepresenting the facts about biotech crops vis-a-vis organic. If the only way that you can increase your market share is by misrepresenting the facts about your opposition, that says something about the value of your product. I want to shift gears a little bit now. We've seen examples of the kinds of benefits that have resulted from crops improved through biotechnology and how they've been encountered in our daily lives and how they've been shared around the world. And we've seen some of the roots of some of the opposition that we have faced. I want to focus now a little bit more on the future and talk about some of the things that we've learned in the last few years and what that means for the next few hundred years. This is a picture of a molecule called CRISPR-Cas9. CRISPR is something, the CRISPR portion, the RNA portion, CRISPR is a molecule with two parts. There is an RNA part and there is a protein part. The RNA part enables bacteria to identify the genes of viruses that infect them. And the blue protein part cuts that virus DNA and repels the infection by the bacterial virus. The CRISPR was discovered in 1987. It's basically a bacteria's defense mechanism against viral infection. It consists of a catalog of short DNA sequences, 24 to 48 base pairs in length, and these function as a history of the exposure that a bacteria has had to viral infections and helps them protect against reinfection by those same sorts of bacteria in the future. It works, as I said, by the CRISPR portion of the complex is basically the picture on the wall in the post office of the wanted criminal, and the Cas moiety, the protein moiety, is the U.S. Marshal that goes out there and busts it. I can't read this backwards, so I'll skip it. Sorry. Where do we find CRISPR in the wild? We have found these sequences of defense mechanisms for bacteria against viral infection virtually every place that we've looked in all sorts of bacteria. It's found pretty much ubiquitously. There are at least 45 families of the protein that cleaves DNA at different places that we've found. And there are libraries of literally tens of thousands of the RNA or DNA guide sequences. And what these allow us to do is, this shows the number of publications in the scientific literature that have cited CRISPR-Cas9 over the past few years. And you can see how CRISPR-Cas9, CRISPR systems have just exploded in their frequency of publication in scientific papers. That that illuminates the degree of excitement that you find amongst researchers, because what this technology, now that we've understood it, has allowed us to do, basically allows us to copy edit the book of life. Any change that you can imagine that you might want to make in DNA, we now have the techniques in order to do this. And if you stop and think about this, you know, this degree of power is really unprecedented. This degree of precise control is something we've never had before. What is it you hear in Spider-Man? With great power comes great responsibility. You know, the last thing we want to do is see this technology misapplied or used to make mischief or do something that would be ill-considered. So those of us who are doing this kind of research think long and hard about this and how it might be misused. And there's a lot of conversation going on about how best to make sure that bad things don't happen and unpleasant surprises don't emerge. But on the other hand, what this looks like is a plant breeder's dream. This gives a partial list showing some of the examples of things that you could imagine you can do with CRISPR-Cas9 that we couldn't really do before. I don't know how many of you have worked on a dairy. I worked on a dairy when I was a kid. And those of you who might have had that experience, been so fortunate to have that kind of experience, will recall that dairy cattle generally have horns. Most other cattle usually don't. That makes working around a dairy sometimes a lot more exciting than working with just general beef cattle. So it's not really necessarily a good thing to have dairy cattle with horns. As a consequence, many dairy farmers will do what they call poll their cattle. They will use a soldering iron or something to destroy the horn buds from which the horns grow in young calves. And you know, that has to be painful. It's certainly unpleasant for farmers, for dairy farmers who are compassionate about their animals. It's certainly something that they don't enjoy doing. But with biotechnology, with CRISPR, there is some research at UC Davis, Alison Van Edenam, a friend of mine, and she took the CRISPR-Cas9 technique and used that to introduce some deletions into the gene that encodes for production of horns in dairy cattle and to render that gene ineffective so that these genetically engineered, gene-edited dairy cattle, they don't grow the horns. And this is, and an additional beauty of this is all the genes involved in this for whatever traits are involved here, they've been part of the human food chain for millennia. So we know this stuff is safe. The Food and Drug Administration is trying to figure out how to deal with some of these complexities, given the requirement that all food be sold in the United States must be safe. And they haven't quite gotten it figured out yet, but they're working on it. In terms of gene therapy, the potential medical applications of these technologies are really dramatic. This has already been used in research animals to cure some diseases of hemoglobin, of oxygen transport, in ways that you could never have imagined doing before the advent of these techniques. This is something which is in the very near future. In point of actual fact, as I said, we can think of ways to use gene editing techniques to turn specific genes on or off, you know, as you would. We've seen the emergence of, we've seen the ability with these technologies to introduce traits like herbicide tolerance in canola, wheat, rice, soy, potato, sorghum, tomato. We've seen other disease resistance techniques that we can use in mice, goats, pigs, sheep, and cattle. We've seen drought tolerant crops become something that we're understanding now how to work on. Drought tolerance has always been one of the most difficult traits to work on in plants because unlike many of the traits we've talked about so far, which are controlled by 1 or 2 genes, drought tolerance is controlled by 6 to 8 major genes with about 80 secondary genes of significant influence and another some 200 genes that are relevant in some combinations. So this is a huge number of independent factors to work with but with marker-assisted selection and gene editing technologies, for the first time now we can imagine how we might be able to improve these traits and produce truly drought-tolerant varieties of crops. We can produce vitamin E-rich fruits, including oranges. We've seen micronutrient-enhanced grains, oil profile modified oil seeds. We've seen enhanced product quality in mushrooms, apples, potatoes, tomatoes. We've seen CRISPR gene drives being used to target mosquito pests, which is not irrelevant here in Puerto Rico, where you have a number of mosquitoes that are plaguing you not only with Zika, but dengue, chikungunya, yellow fever, and more. We now, with gene editing techniques, have the ability to suppress those populations in a way that has far fewer secondary impacts than the use of the chemical pesticide sprays that we would have used. As I said, virtually everything you can imagine, we can figure out ways to modify. What else could we do? It's not beyond the realm of imagination that you could cure very complicated and intractable diseases like HIV. Other genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy, Huntington's, chorea, things like this all become tractable, and most are being pursued with these new gene editing techniques right now. You can imagine ways to cure cancer by improving or restoring p53-mediated functions for tumor suppression. Other complex traits like nitrogen fixation, we can now imagine how to fix. We can eradicate invasive species. What else can you think of? Virtually everything you can think of becomes tractable. With such great stories, why are we still in a hole with some people? Well, as I mentioned, there is a sector of the organic food community that has deliberately adopted fear-based marketing as a mechanism to grow their market share. Greenpeace, I could give a separate lecture on Greenpeace's role in this, but the modern anti-biotech campaigns basically started with Greenpeace because they needed a good fundraising technique to dig them out of a hole their political actions had gotten them into in Europe. I'd love to talk about that if you want to hear more. But one of the Greenpeace spokespersons said in that context, our purpose is not to be scientifically correct. That's the corporation and robber baron's job. Our job is to move the needle and affect radical change. So again, they're interested in bringing about their vision of how things ought to be, and they have no regard for facts if they get in the way. There is a law case called Resolute versus Greenpeace. Has anybody heard of this? Resolute is a timber company in Canada. Greenpeace had been attacking Resolute for a number of years, misrepresenting the facts about what that timber company was doing and using that as a very effective fundraising tool. Resolute took Greenpeace to court and sued them for slander and for libel. Greenpeace lost the case. In defending themselves against the lawsuit, Greenpeace's spokesperson said their representations of Resolute had been marked by hyperbole, heated rhetoric, and non-verifiable statements of subjective opinion that should not be taken literally. One observer summarized this as saying they're showing a fundamental disregard for scientific reality. Facts matter, but this is an article that I would strongly recommend everybody in here read. All of you engage, I'm sure, in conversations with your neighbors, with your family, with your friends, and many of them must have questions about GMOs. And how can you support such a thing? How can you stand to be affiliated with this company that has such a horrible reputation? Well, this article from the New Yorker will provide some really illuminating insights into the way we think and make decisions. So also this book. I'm a scientist. I'm accustomed to following the facts where they lead. So it was a stunning shock to me when a journalist friend of mine introduced me to this book because this book summarizes what cognitive psychologists have learned over the past couple of decades about the way humans think, the way we approach complicated issues, and the role that facts have in how we reach decisions about things we encounter in our daily lives. And what it comes down to, it's all in how you tell the story. So as you talk with your neighbors and your friends, you know, for 25 years, I followed what this literature describes as the deficit model. As a scientist trained to follow the facts where they lead, you know, that is a difficult thing to do, and sometimes it can be very painful, but facts are stubborn things. They don't go away just because you find them unpleasant. So, you know, as a scientist, I'm committed to following them where they lead, but most humans don't do that. People generally do not follow facts to a conclusion. Most of us align with our tribe, our community, and we base our decisions about how we deal with novel or challenging or controversial ideas on the way our tribe is aligned on this and what will allow us to function most smoothly with our tribe. People align their views with their tribe's views, and then they look for facts to buttress that alignment. And in a context like that, when you take a deficit model, when you tell somebody, no, you're wrong, biotech crops don't increase chemical pesticide use, they do the opposite. When you do that, you're not providing them with facts, you're challenging their identity. The only thing humans, in my experience, the only thing humans are less rational about than food is sex. They're both fundamental to our identity. They're very emotionally radioactive, very easy to misunderstand, very easy to get wrong, very easy to make mistakes, and so our sensitivity levels are extremely high. Food is integral to our identity in ways that almost nothing else is. And so when we challenge people in terms of their understanding of facts about foods, this is felt as an attack on their identity and values. A far more effective way to communicate with people who might disagree with you is not to try to give them facts they may not have, but in fact to establish and build on some kind of emotional rapport. 5 years ago, I would never have started a talk with a picture of my family or me as a beekeeper, because that's pushing emotional buttons. And as a scientist, you know, my thinking was, you know, you can do that, and it's really effective, but it's cheating. You know, we need to follow the facts where they lead, you know, and make decisions based on what the data tell us. Well, I still believe that. Facts are important, but you have to find a way to present facts in a way that your audience will hear. And that's what I wanted to leave on with you, and be happy to discuss this further with you, because people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So thank you very much for listening to me today. I hope I haven't put anybody to sleep in the after lunch hour. I'll leave you with this, one of my favorite cartoons. Something is just not right. Our air is clean, our water is pure, we all get plenty of exercise, everything we eat is organic and free range, and yet nobody lives past 30. Thank you for your time, for your attention. I'd be happy to take any comment.